you're recording to the right place. Okay. So my presentation today is on Q codes and Prosigns, and I'm also going to talk a little bit about some Morse code abbreviation stuff. But let's go ahead and jump right in. So what are Q codes? We've all heard people use these on the air. Q codes are short three-letter codes for particular messages. They can be used for both questions and answers or statements. And they always start with the letter Q. And for that reason, you will never anywhere in the world have a call sign that starts with a Q. And no country ITU prefixes will ever start with a Q, because these Q codes are meant to be internationally used. They're meant to be language independent. They were originally created back in the Morse code days when everything was happening on Morse code, telegraph and the original radio systems. And we're going to talk a little bit about some of the history there as well as we move along. But we often use some of them, at least, in voice communications as well today. So they're broken down into ranges. QAA through QNZ are reserved for aeronautical use or airplane traffic. QOA through QQZ are reserved for maritime use, and QRA through QUZ are available for all services. And QVA through QZZ are not used. And like I said, they can be used as either a question or an answer or statement. They've kind of been modified over time. So, the codes that are used are not exactly the same as they were back in 1910. For example, QSW originally was, shall I increase my spark gap frequency? Well, I don't know of anybody who's doing spark gap transmissions today, but back in the early days of the Marconi wireless sets, basically there was the Morse code was when you created a spark, it made a noise and the receiver would pick up that. And so this would basically mean speed up my transmission speed. Now it's used for, will you send on this frequency? Back in the original spark gap days, everything was on every frequency at once. So you didn't really have individual frequencies. So now we do, and we take advantage of that fact. They were originally created around 1909 by the British government. They were used for communications between ships and between ship to shore. There was a list of 45 codes that were published after the Third International Radio Telegraph Convention that was held in London in 1912. Well, some examples are like QRA, what ship is this? And if you're sending it as a response, it would be this is, and then you would give the name of the ship. QRD, where are you bound for? So if you're asking the question, you're asking where are you going? And the response would be QRD Liverpool, for example. I'm bound for Liverpool. And what line do you belong to? I belong to the whatever line, right? So shipping pretty much all belong to various lines. So you might have like the Cunard line or something like that. So the Q codes have been adapted to amateur use. We use the QRA through QUZ codes. Not all codes make sense in amateur usage. For example, QSJ, how much will this transmission cost? We obviously don't charge anything for amateur transmissions. We're not allowed to. So that one we don't use. Originally used in CW, Morse code, but now frequently used in voice transmissions as well. So you might hear someone say, that was a nice QSO or QSO, or there's a lot of QRM. There's a lot of noise happening, right? So, but they're often used outside of radio communications as well. So the ARRL has a magazine that they produce every month called the Qst Magazine. QST is the Q code for general call to all stations. And there's the QRZ website. QRZ is the code for who's calling me, right? So we use them in a lot of different places, not just in radio transmissions now. So I have a list of codes here that we use in amateur use. and we'll just kind of go through each one and we'll talk about it. So QNA, not applicable, right? NA stands for not applicable. That's pretty straightforward. It obviously doesn't work as a question, as you can't ask someone, hey, is that not applicable? That doesn't really make sense. But it can be used to answer net control in a prearranged order, or only a specialized station should check in. So you would do something like Q and A for a particular station, right? And then that particular station would check in on the net. QNF is the net free, or the net is free. Basically, can I use the frequency, or are you guys in the middle of a conversation or something? QNI, may I join the net? QNU, do you have any traffic for me? QNX, may I be excused? QRA, what's the name of your station? QRG, will you tell me my exact frequency? So basically you're asking, hey, what frequency are you hearing me on, right? And a particular frequency is used to respond on that. QRH, does my frequency vary? So with HF, sometimes your transmission isn't very solid because of atmospheric effects. Things like the ionosphere can affect the frequency of your transmission. So they want to know, is my frequency going up and down a little bit? What's my tone of my transmission? Is it looking good? Is it bad? How many voice contacts do you want to make? I want to make however many voice contacts. These are used in pileups or things when there's a station that everybody's trying to get to, and he wants to do maybe 10 contacts. So he's going to say, I'm going to do 10, right? What's my signal readability, QRK? Or what's the readability of a specified station? And then you would respond with the readability of your signal is 1 through 5. QRL, are you busy? You might use that in conversation as well. Hey, Dan, QRL. Dan could respond with, no, I'm not busy. What do you want to talk about? QRM, do you have interference, or I have interference? QRN, are you troubled by static? I am troubled by static. So pretty straightforward utilization of these. QRO, should I increase power? Should I decrease power? Should I send faster? Should I send more slowly? Should I stop sending, or I am going to stop sending? I'm going to shut off my radio. I'm going QRT. I'm leaving operation or for whatever reason. QRU, do you have anything for me, or I have some messages for you? Are you ready? I'm ready. All basically straightforward messages that are available, and simplified by using these Q codes. So when you can imagine when you're sending Morse code, if I was going to say, hey, should I tell N7XDL that you're calling him on 14.135 kilohertz or megahertz, and if I was going to send that in Morse, that's going to take quite a bit of time to send all of that. If I just said QRW N7XDL 14.135, I'm done, right? So,
and I'll say no because I'm a general and I'm not authorized to transmit on that frequency.
There you go. See, exactly. QRX, should I stand by, or when should I stand by until, and stand by until I call you again at whatever time. QRZ, who's calling? We talked about QRZ already in the context of the website. That's why they picked QRZ for the website name, because of the Q code and what it means. QSA, what's my signal strength? Am my signals fading? Is my keying defective? And that keying is, how you're sending your Morse code. Am I sending it correctly, or am I sending it poorly, right? QSG, shall I send some number of messages at a time? QSH, stay happy and healthy. QSK, can you hear me between your signals? These are all standard Q codes that are in amateur use right now. QSL, can you acknowledge receipt? QSM, Should I repeat the message, or should I repeat any messages? And then you could respond with repeat message number 3 or whatever, and then the sending station would resend that. QSN, did you hear me on a particular frequency? QSO, can you communicate with, or I can communicate with. QSO, we use that to indicate a particular conversation, typically. So you'll say, oh, I had a great eyeball QSO with Dan last weekend. And that means I actually ran into Dan at the store and we had a chat, face to face. QSP, will you relay a message? QSR, should I repeat? QSS, what frequency are you planning to use? QST, should I repeat the prior message to everyone? Or this is a general broadcast message for all amateurs. That's, again, the name of the magazine, the Qst Magazine. QSU, shall I send on a frequency? Or you should send on this frequency? QSW, will you send? QSX, will you listen to? QSY, shall I? This is the one that we use a lot in voice operations, QSY. Hey, I'm going to change to another frequency. I'm going to QSY over to the 6.2 repeater, for example. Or I'm going to QSY to, say you're going up Parley's Canyon, I'm going to QSY to the Heber repeater as I'm getting out of range of the Salt Lake repeaters. Or, hey, we should QSY to Simplex because we're close enough to each other. I can hear you on the input, right? QSZ, should I send each word or more than once? QTA, should I cancel the message? QTC, how many messages do you have to send? Here's another one that we use in voice communications too, the QTH. What's your position? We use it to indicate where we're at now, right? My position is a latitude and longitude, might be a grid square location or something like that, or it might be my QTH is Murray, Utah, right? So just indicating where you're at. QTR, what's the correct time? QTU, what times are you going to be operating? I'm operating from 0300 to 0700, for example. And then I have to go eat lunch, right? QTX, will you keep your station open until some specified time or until further notice? And then you could respond, yeah, I'll keep my station open for a little while. And QUA, have you heard about somebody, or here's information about a particular call sign. Then QUC, what's the number of the last message you received from me? Or the number or last message I received from you is whatever. QUD, have you received the urgency signal? QUE, can you speak in some other language with an interpreter if necessary? So say you know Spanish, you could reply, I can speak in Espanol on whatever frequency. QF, have you received the distress signal? Pretty straightforward, right? For codes that just need to be acknowledged as having been received, it's common to just send R or Roger. R is just a lot quicker to type or to Morse code send than Roger. For codes that need an affirmative response, it's common to send C for correct. And for codes that need a negative response, it's common to just send N for no, right? So I know no is not that much longer to send than just N, but that's the common mechanism. So informal usage. You often use it as part of a phrase when you use it in voice communications, like, hey, what's your QTH, right? And CW would just send QTH in the interrogative or question mark to indicate that it was a question. Sometimes unofficial Q codes are used, like QLF. Hey, are you sending with your left foot? Or try sending with your left foot. It might work better, right? That's kind of a joke, right? Instead of sending with your hand, send with your left foot. Or QNB, I love this one. How many buttons are on your radio? NB for number of buttons. My QNB is 100/5. My radio has 100 buttons, and I know what 5 of them do. So, And then QSY can be used to refer to a physical move. Oh, did you know that N7 LCR is going to QSY to Murray? No, he's going to stay in West Valley. So,
Hey, one thing about the QLF,
yeah,
you know what the left foot and right foot referring to, right?
it regale us down.
Okay. Well, you know, with HF, with HF radios, you have a paddle. You also have a foot paddle that you can use. And when I'm doing contesting, or not, I have my headset on and I do all my transmitting with my feet. And it's an actual step paddle that you step on um, to do your
Really?
transmitting. Yeah.
I did not know that.
So when they say you're sending with your left foot, you're messing up on your transmissions. And sending with your right foot, things are going well. Yeah.
Huh.
So
I was not aware of that. I knew that you could have a floor switch for your PTT.
yeah,
Uh,
that's what I'm talking about. That floor switch, that little
okay.
paddle that you step on.
Okay.
That's Yep, that's your PTT.
Awesome. Yeah, that's very
Yeah,
interesting. So that's maybe not as facetious as I thought it was.
that's right.
Try using your right foot instead. It might work better, right?
Yeah.
So another thing you'll find is that on ARRL nets, even though QN codes are really in the aeronautical space, the ARRL does use some QN codes in their nets, and the FCC has agreed that that's okay. Uh, I don't think they've especially sanctioned it, but they've said as long as there's no confusion, obviously you're not an airplane, so asking if you can land at a particular place doesn't make sense for an amateur station. So, that's a case of, where you might use one of these QN codes. These are some examples of QN codes that we would use in one of these ARRL nets. Q&A, this is a request from net control for all respondents to answer in a prearranged sequence, maybe alphabetical by call sign. QNB, this is a request from net control for one station to relay traffic. So that's another thing that might happen with HF communications, right? You may have a condition because of the way the ionosphere is sitting or the way stations are positioned. You might have two stations that can't hear each other, but another station can hear both of them and talk to both of them. And so you may be needing to have someone relay information from one station to another. Um, that typically doesn't happen with the VHF nets that we're all familiar with because everybody can hear the repeater or they can't really do much. And so, that's typically not an issue. We do have sometimes, I've noticed on our nets, where someone will come in and be really lost in the noise. You can't hear what they're saying. All you can hear is that they're breaking squelch on the repeater. Mike and Connie seem to be victims of this more often than not. And I've noticed that, in that kind of a condition, there might be another station that is close enough to hear them directly on the input, and that station could act as a relay. And if that's the case, that station could announce, "Hey, I can relay for that calling in station," and so that's something that could be done. QNC would be like an announcement telling all stations on the net to stand by for an all stations message. QND would be an announcement by net control that the net is currently operating in directed mode. That means if you need to say something, you should ask net control before you do. This is often done during times of high net usage. QNE is basically saying, hey, all stations on the net stop transmitting and stand by. QNF, an announcement the net is no longer connected but is free. Remember we had a Q code earlier that we talked about. Is the net free? The net is free. Basically, that's meaning that, hey, we have this net, but you can go ahead and communicate among stations on the net. Right there, you don't have to go through net control to to do a communication between two stations. Q and G would be a request for a named station to assume the role of net control. Q and H would be a notice for a named station that the frequency they're transmitting on is higher, H for higher. Q and L would indicate lower, right? Q and I could be a request for stations to announce themselves or an announcement that they've joined. For example, if I'm getting on a net, I could send KD7 ZWV QNI and just saying that, hey, I'm joining the net. Q and J, when used by itself, is ask the net if the calling station can be heard. When used in conjunction with a call sign, it's asking the net if anybody can read a particular station. Q and K would be a request from net control to send a message from a third party to a specific station. And Q and L would be a notice to the station that the frequency they're transmitting on is lower. We talked about that was in context with Q and H, higher and lower. Q and M would be a notice that you're causing interference on the net. Please stop transmitting. Q and N as a question, it asks, hey, who's the net control? If you're doing it as a statement, you're saying, hey, I'm the net control, or this is the net control. Q and O would be an announcement that they're signing off. Q and P announces the sending station was unable to understand the last station or unable to copy the last named station. Q and Q would be a request asking for a specific station to change frequency and wait for a different station, a named station on that frequency to finish whatever traffic it's currently engaged in and to then send that station traffic on behalf of yet a third named station. So that's kind of a complicated one. Q and R request any station respond to a named station and receive traffic from them. Q and S ask for a list of all stations currently on the net or announces what stations are on the net. Q and T, a request by a station to leave the net for a period of time. Q and U, an announcement by net control to a specific station telling them that there is traffic for them. Q and V would be a request from net control asking a specific station to make contact on the current frequency with a named station, and then when they're successful to QSY to another specified frequency, and then send traffic based on a third named station. And Q and W would be a question from a station inquiring on how to route traffic for a particular station. Q and X as a question would be a request to leave the net. Q and X from the net control would be, yes, it's okay to leave. Q and Y would be a request from net control for a station to change to a different frequency. And Q and Z would be a request for one station to another station asking that other station to zero beat with the first station. So they want to transmit simultaneously to be able to fine tune what frequency they're on until they're on the same frequency. So that's kind of a complicated one to think about, and that's something that only works on HF or on AM or single sideband, where two stations can transmit at the same time and still receive at the same time. So basically it's trying to help two stations get on the exact same frequency. Okay, so enough about Q codes. Let's talk about prosigns. Prosigns are procedural signs. So prosign is short for procedural sign. They're used primarily in CW transmissions. They indicate special signals or control instructions. Kind of like, you know how you have control keys on your keyboard on your computer. For example, you may not have been aware of this, but your control keys actually have names. So, for example, Control S is the X on character, and that's basically saying, hey, it's okay to transmit to me. And Control Q is the X off character, which says, hey, stop transmitting to me. And those control keys are used in making communications work on some kind of serial communications medium. So these prosigns are similar in use to those. Some of the other control key codes would be like Control J is line feed, Control L is form feed, Control K is reverse line feed, Control H is backspace, and so those are control codes that were part of the ASCII language, and so in the same fashion, these prosigns are part of the CW language or the Morse language. Now, they're not the same as brevity codes. We'll talk about some brevity codes or abbreviations later, but they are used for standardization. Again, the potential exists that you're talking to a station in another language, and if you can use a code that is known to both stations, that will simplify your communications. They're generally written as a 2-letter sequence, typically with an overbar, and transmitted without an interletter gap. So we'll talk about some example prosigns. My favorite is DE, which is the word DE or D is French for from. And so you'll often see me in my communications in email, I'll use DE to indicate that this is from my call sign. So if you've ever wondered why I do that, that's what I'm doing there. NIL would be nothing heard. R is Roger. K is over. Here's one with an overbar on it. So if you transmit the A and R characters with no space in between them, that's the prosign, meaning out or end of transmission, right? CL would be closing. I'm closing my station. CQ, we are all familiar with CQ. It basically means, hey, any station out there, please respond. The AS prosign with A and S together with no gap in between them, no interletter gap between them, means pause a few minutes. I'm listening to another station. Please stand by. VE is verified. Your message was verified. Might send a question mark, which is basically meaning, hey, I didn't understand that. Please send it again. Or you might use that with a Q code to indicate that the Q code is a question, not a statement. HH means that the preceding text was in error. The following text is the corrected text. You may historically have seen this written as E with an overbar over all 8 E's. And if you think about it, since an E is a single dot and an H is 4 dots, HH is exactly the same as E, right? So that's an interesting tidbit. You may find that some people use different abbreviations, but that they sound exactly the same because of that fact that multiple Morse letters can run together and mean the same thing. C would be a response indicating correct. We talked about that one already. N for no or negative. Let's talk about that for a second. When we say Roger, we're basically, all we're saying is, hey, I got your message. I heard your message. It doesn't mean I'm going to do anything about it. It doesn't mean that I understood what it wanted. It just means I received it, right? C is saying, yes, I got your message, and the answer is yes. Or N is, yes, I got your message, and the answer is no. So there's a difference between Roger and correct, right? So that's something to think about. If you're in conversation with somebody and you hear them say Roger, basically all they're saying is, I heard you, not that I'm going to actually do what you said. So keep that in mind. BT is break, basically means I'm going to start a new section of a message. BK, and then, here BK does not have the overbar, so it's actually said as B followed by K, stands for break. Try to interrupt its transmission already in progress. KA is the attention signal. It means the message begins, or we're going to start sending a string of messages, or I'm going to send a new message or something like that. I'm basically saying, hey, here comes a message, pay attention. And WX would be weather report. So if I sent WX question mark, I'm asking for a weather report, and I might follow that up with WX and a particular indication of the temperature, wind speed, things like that. So, other abbreviations that you'll hear on the air, and you'll hear these in conversation as well. 73, that basically means best regards. And I would like to say here, I know some of us, not to mention any names, not mentioning any names, will say 73s with an S on the end, and that means best regardses. So it's not necessary to put an S on the end of 73. So I'm not going to say that if you do that, you're wrong, but if you do that, you're wrong. So 88, hugs and kisses. Hi, you'll hear that sometimes. People will actually say that on the air. They'll say, oh, hi. That basically is laughing. And if you think about it, if you send that in Morse, you're sending dit, right? So it kind of sounds like somebody laughing. An OM is an old man. So basically that means an operator, somebody, an amateur radio operator. That's kind of a sexist one because we actually have a lot of females who are radio operators now, and it's really, you don't really want to call them old man. So probably want to stay away from that one. Correspondingly, YL is young lady, and that's typically used to refer to your girlfriend. And so your XYL is your ex young lady or your wife. So again, those two are kind of sexist as well, and we probably should not use those very much. And then a DX would be a long distance contact or a rare station. For example, if you're participating in summits on the air and you've climbed to the top of Mount McKinley and you're transmitting from there, that's a rare station, right? So it's not very often that somebody gets to the top of Mount McKinley with a radio in their hands. And so if you can make a contact with that as a DX station, that would be a real great thing to put in your logbook. Okay, that's basically what I've got. That really went faster than I expected it to, but that's okay. So, Q questions, answers, conversation. Take it away, folks. Silence.
Yeah, those codes are all published someplace, aren't they?
They are all published in several places, right? So, a lot of those have been standardized by the ITU. The ones for the ARRL net codes, there's actually a website here that has those. You can download that. And when I post this presentation, I'll include this link. I'll include some links to some of the other places where those codes are defined as well. So yeah, those codes are all published. They're well documented. So, other questions, comments, things of that sort?
I have a question on in the early 90s, we got a nasty note from the government. We were in I was in Civil Air Patrol, and whenever we were flying over a position, we would refer to ourselves as CapCon. And since NASA used that and didn't want to share, they stopped us from using that. But anyway, what would that fall under, like that particular name?
I would think that would be a tactical call sign more than anything else, right?
That's what I was thinking. I was just wondering if there were certain categories for, anything like that.
So in NASA parlance, CapCon is the capsule communicator, right?
Right, that's right.
So in space flight, there's typically one person who is designated as the Capcom at any moment, and they are the only person who talks on the radio to the spacecraft. So when the spacecraft needs to talk to somebody, they relay it through the Capcom. They typically don't talk. Like if you wanted to talk to the flight surgeon, say you were in space and you needed to ask the flight surgeon a question, you would route that question through the Capcom. And if the flight surgeon was monitoring your heart rate and noticed it was really high, they might say something like, hey, Capcom, tell the astronaut to calm down, their heart rate is too high, or something like that. So as far as why they objected to your use of Capcom, I mean, technically, I guess you weren't talking to a capsule, so it's not entirely accurate to use it. But I don't see how it would have really mattered that much. But I guess they prefer to avoid confusion there.
No, understandable. It was Civil Air Patrol Communications is what it was before. That's what we called ourselves.
Yeah.
So
I guess in naval aviation, the CAP is the carrier, the combat air patrol. Combat patrol or carrier air patrol. Basically, it's the planes that are up in the air ready to engage any kind of opposition that may present itself at any given time, right? So I can see you using it in that context, but CAP for Civil Air Patrol, right? Which is probably why you picked that as your tactical call sign. But I can't see that it would have really mattered, but they probably were just trying to avoid confusion. But yeah.
Well, since it's an auxiliary of the Air Force,
right?
It's plus you were using their frequencies. Like a lot of our stuff was done around just above 400 meg.
Okay.
So
not in the amateur ranges, but in frequency space that was set aside just for Civil Air Patrol use, right?
Yeah, we used I think 408 up to 4 and a few others, and 418 was the highest one in there. So plus we used either side of the amateur band. Like I think we held nets, and most of our communication was on the repeater that was, what was it, 143.9 for input and 148.15 for output or receive,
Yeah.
So we had over a 4 meg offset. So
yeah. So those, again, they were specific to Civil Air Patrol use, so they probably just didn't want any kind of confusion there.
Right, exactly.
But yeah, I would assume you could come up with a different tactical call sign for that. I think we talked about tactical call signs. I think Dan talked about that in a previous session. So
yeah, that's true. Thanks.
Yeah. Other questions or comments? So one thing that I want to kind of mention, we don't use the 10 codes. You guys are familiar with 10 codes like 10.4 and 10.10 and things like that. We don't use those in amateur use. It's not because we couldn't use them. It's just that we don't use them. Those are typically holding a connotation of citizens band radio, or sometimes they're typically based on the police or emergency services codes, and so we avoid using those because we don't want people to think that we're the plebes who are on citizens band, or that we are pretending to be actual civil service emergency services personnel. So we avoid using the 10 codes in amateur radio. When you hear a new amateur come on and they, hey, 10.4 on that, it's like you have to calmly explain to them, oh, we don't say things like that on an amateur radio. We just talk, and that's what kind of confuses people, because we just talk. We just say the actual words, and then we drop things like QSO and QSY and things like that all the time too. So we kind of break our own rule in that regard when we're on voice communications and phone communications.
Well, it's the whole idea of communication is to make it simple and to get the message across, and even using the Q codes, it doesn't really follow that, especially like new people. They don't know what
They don't know what it
they
means.
don't know what it means, you know. And well, I know the different agencies, police agencies, they still argue about what particular 10 codes mean because they're all not. It's
They're
not
not all
universal.
standardized, correct? Yeah, so that can be a factor as well, because you know I mean, there are some that are pretty standard, like 10.4, meaning confirmed or essentially correct or Roger. Um, like 10.9, meaning I wasn't able to receive that, or 10.10, what's your location, or 10.20, it'd be what's your location. I don't remember what 10.10 is, but yeah, they could be different. Some of the codes could be completely different, and so we do have the Q codes standardized and published internationally, so that's a factor in our favor. But I agree that when you're doing phone communications, or when you're like chatting on the repeater, when you say things like, "Oh, we should QSY over to Simplex 5.2 or something like that," we probably ought to just say, "Hey, why don't we switch over to this frequency instead of what we're on," right? Rather than using QSY. It just reduces the ambiguity. And like you say, newer hams that are more likely to be monitoring and afraid to say something are going to be made more afraid to say something if they don't understand what you're talking about, right? So
That's true. Well, especially in like the events going on, because a lot of these events have accidents and like bicycle crashes and all that. And it's a lot easier to say we had a accident at this location and tell them where you are, you
yeah,
know.
rather than trying
Yeah,
to say the QTH is whatever or something, so
yeah.
yeah. And so that's something to consider when you're thinking, should I use a Q code in this case? Obviously, if you're using CW, then go ahead and use the Q code, because if you're using CW, you probably understand what the Q codes are. But if you're on phone and you're just talking to somebody, it kind of makes sense to not use those. And again, there, as with all things, there are exceptions to the rule. And so if you're talking to someone and both of you know that QSY means change frequency to whatever, you could use that. Um, but it certainly makes sense to not inject that confusion factor when you don't need to. And that's why we generally avoid using the 10 codes, because we just talk. We're not trying to be fancy. We're not pretending to be emergency services personnel. We're just amateurs, and we're out there talking to each other. So something to keep in mind.
Well, I was told a long time ago, it's if you're trying to, let's see, what is it? It's better to be cool rather than try and sound cool.
Yeah, right. Yes, completely agreed on that one. Other comments? All right. Well, I'm going to stop the recording.